Thank you, member. Recognizing North Coast.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I'm happy to rise today to speak to Bill 36. Our government is proud to introduce the Gaming Control Amendment Act. The Act will entitle BC First Nations to a portion of the BC Lottery Corporation's net income for 23 years. Now, why 23 years? Because we've actually made a 25-year agreement and have already fronted the first 2 years of that funding. It also, this amendment or this act will increase the maximum number of directors on the BC Lottery Corporation to 11 to facilitate the appointment of one position for a First Nations nominee. This will create a reliable long-term revenue stream for First Nations as part of our commitment to reconciliation, and I say a part of our commitment to reconciliation. It will ensure First Nations have a stable, predictable source of income to fund economic, social, and cultural activities that directly benefit the people who live in their communities. Each First Nation can use the gaming revenue to support their own priorities, like enhancing social services, education, infrastructure, cultural revitalization, and self-government capacity. Now, we've already transferred nearly $200 million to the newly formed BC First Nations Gaming Revenue Sharing Limited Partnership, providing the first 2 years of shared gaming revenue, as I just mentioned. For those that are concerned about how does this impact the gaming revenue sharing we have with local governments, well, it doesn't affect local governments. The new gaming revenue sharing arrangement doesn't affect what community groups will receive and what municipalities that have casinos or gaming centers in their communities that they host. It was over a decade ago when I think First Nations in British Columbia started lobbying various provincial governments for a portion of the gaming revenue. Other provinces, Ontario and Saskatchewan, off the top of my head, share gaming revenue, and British Columbia, well, we're kind of late on the page to sharing our gaming revenue. It was in the early 2000s that First Nations actually described the plan to share revenue as the single most important action the provincial government could take to, quote, ease First Nations poverty and begin to close the economic and social gap for all First Nations. Now, the member for Skeena had spent quite a bit of time talking about how offended he was at the terms closing the economic gap, but I just wanted to point out that these were words that Indigenous people had used themselves to actually describe their current situation. These aren't our words. These aren't the provincial government's words. So this agreement is expected to provide First Nations with approximately $100 million per year, and that's factoring in an expected 2% annual growth rate. The province expects to share around $3 billion with BC First Nations over the term of the agreement. One of the things I wanted to point out, because it's really relevant to the Indigenous communities that I represent in North Coast, and that is how the breakdown of the sharing formula works out. So 50% participating First Nations can obtain their share of the gaming revenue based on the following formula: 50% base funding divided equally per community, 40% based on population, and 10% for geographically remote communities. These funds may be used by individual nations for health and wellness, infrastructure, safety, transportation and housing, economic and business development, education, language, culture and training, community development and environmental protection, and capacity building, fiscal management and governance. So there isn't really anything that this funding can't support, Honourable Speaker. This agreement aligns us with other provinces such as Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Nova Scotia, which already share gaming revenue with First Nations. Now, the member from Skeena also mentioned that we hadn't consulted with the federal government. Well, when in fact the federal government was actually quite surprised and shocked that we weren't already sharing provincial gaming revenue. And no, it doesn't impact the funding that First Nations will receive from the federal government. First Nations have been demanding equitable funding for decades. And the member from Skeena, as well as Nechako Lakes, talked about dependency. The member from Nechako Lakes referenced Calvin Helene's book, Dances with Dependency. And I agree that it is a well-written book. However, I don't see how sharing gaming revenue, which is essentially providing equitable funding to allow First Nations autonomy over their own priorities, how does that create dependency? In fact, I can't believe that the BC Liberals are opposing this and that are speaking so negatively about this step. They've spoken about paternalism and how offensive this is in the face of reconciliation, which I actually find pretty offensive. What's paternalistic is inequitable top-down, clawback-ridden contribution system that's been in place for decades. That's what's paternalistic, is what First Nations have been facing for decades. The member from Skeena talked about asking for money and how that was degrading and how humiliating that was. Especially when you think of the concept that most of the revenues probably came from the territory in the first place. So I absolutely sympathize with that statement. Here we are, a colonial government. We're making a decision in this legislature on how we share gaming revenue, which is essentially money earned from the land that we stole from Indigenous people. And the fact that we actually have to have this debate is really, really troubling for me. Really troubling for me. It should be a bill that is easy to pass because it's actually a really, really small step in the face of reconciliation. First Nations have been advocating for shared gaming revenues for years. And in my opinion, that should be enough to guide the actions of this House. Settlers who created our own colonial systems are not the thought leaders on the way forward to reconciliation. So the member from Nechako Lakes offering that we are paying off our friends or that we're somehow creating dependency, I think that is what's really offensive. Settlers created this system, and reconciliation is about standing with First Nations. It's about standing beside them, taking actions that enable First Nations to reclaim their own agency. That's what matters. And if First Nations have been talking and telling the government the same thing consistently for years, it's a pretty good bet that this is a step in the right direction, and we should all be voting in favor of this bill. Thank you.